My hands still tremble when I think about that Thursday evening in March of 1987, the night everything I believed in for 43 years crumbled like ancient parchment exposed to flame. I was sitting in the third row of the Kingdom Hall on Maple Street in Portland, Oregon, my worn leather Bible open to Proverbs, when I witnessed something that would haunt me for the next 37 years of my life. The fluorescent lights hummed their usual monotonous tune, casting that sterile glow over the beige walls adorned with paintings of paradise, and I remember thinking how peaceful everything looked, how orderly, how divine. But beneath that carefully constructed surface of spiritual unity lurked secrets so disturbing that even now, at 70 years old, I wake up in cold sweats, my wife Martha gently shaking my shoulder, asking me if I'm having those dreams again. They told us we were the chosen ones, the only true Christians who would survive Armageddon and walk into a new world where lions would lie down with lambs and death would be no more. I believed every word. I pioneered for 22 years, knocking on doors in the scorching Arizona heat and the freezing Michigan winters, carrying my leather bag filled with Watchtower magazines and Awake publications, convinced I was saving lives with every doorbell I rang. I served as a ministerial servant for 15 years, then as an elder for another 12, sitting on judicial committees that decided the spiritual fate of congregation members, disfellowshipping teenagers for holding hands before marriage, shunning families who dared to question the governing body's interpretations of Scripture. But that night in 1987 changed everything. What I saw behind the closed doors of the back room, what I heard whispered between the elders during a private meeting I wasn't supposed to attend, what I discovered hidden in the congregation's financial records that were accidentally left on the secretary's desk, it all combined to shatter the illusion I had lived inside for most of my adult life. The truth wasn't just uncomfortable, it was devastating, and it would cost me everything I held dear. I lost my family when I finally spoke up. My 3 children, all baptized witnesses, haven't spoken to me in decades. My grandchildren don't know my face except from old photographs my daughter keeps hidden in her attic. But I cannot stay silent anymore, because what happens inside those kingdom halls, behind those friendly smiles and welcoming handshakes, needs to be exposed before more lives are consumed by an organization that values obedience over truth, control over compassion, and reputation over justice. This is my story, and I'm finally breaking the silence. Before I take you into the depths of what I discovered, I need you to understand something crucial about my life as a Jehovah's Witness. When I was baptized at 17 years old in 1972 at a district convention in Pasadena, California, I truly believed I was dedicating my life to God. My parents had raised me in the faith since I was 4, when a pleasant woman named Sister Reynolds knocked on our door in suburban Sacramento with her warm smile and her promise of eternal life in paradise. My mother, grieving the recent loss of her own mother to cancer, was vulnerable and searching for answers about death and suffering, and the witnesses had all the answers neatly packaged in colorful brochures with pictures of happy people petting pandas and picking fruit in a garden that looked like something from a tourism poster. I grew up attending 3 meetings a week without fail, the Tuesday night book study in Brother Henderson's musty living room that always smelled like mothballs and instant coffee, the Thursday night theocratic ministry school where I learned to give talks from the platform starting at age 8, and the Sunday morning Watchtower study followed by the public talk, sitting in those uncomfortable wooden chairs for hours while my young mind absorbed doctrine after doctrine about blood transfusions being equivalent to cannibalism, about birthdays and Christmas being pagan celebrations that would displease Jehovah, about the imminent arrival of Armageddon that was always just around the corner, perpetually delayed but never forgotten. My childhood was consumed by field service, going door to door every Saturday morning while my school friends played baseball and went to birthday parties I was forbidden to attend, by convention attendance where we sat in stadium seats for 8 hours a day listening to talks about submission and obedience, by studying Watchtower publications until my eyes burned and my young brain couldn't absorb another prophecy about the King of the North or another interpretation of Daniel's visions. But I wasn't miserable, or at least I didn't think I was at the time. The organization gave me purpose, structure, a sense of belonging to something greater than myself. I had brothers and sisters in every city I visited, instant friends who would open their homes to me because we shared the same faith, spoke the same spiritual language, followed the same rigid moral code that separated us from the wicked world outside that was controlled by Satan and destined for destruction. When I met my wife Sarah at a circuit assembly in 1974, I thought God had blessed me with a perfect companion who shared my zeal for the truth, who would stand beside me through persecution and hardship as we waited for the new system to arrive. We married 6 months later in a simple Kingdom Hall ceremony with no toast, no dancing, no celebration beyond a modest reception in the fellowship hall with punch and cookies, because anything more would have been considered worldly and excessive. Now, before I continue with this account that will disturb you in ways you cannot yet imagine, I need you to do something for me. If you're watching this testimony, if my words are reaching you through whatever medium you're using, I need you to subscribe to this channel, press that like button, and most importantly, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, because I need to know how far this message travels, how many people are willing to listen to an old man's confession about the organization that controlled his life for 4 decades. Your engagement helps this truth reach others who might still be trapped inside the system I'm about to expose, families who are being torn apart by shunning policies, young people who are contemplating suicide because they've been disfellowshipped and cut off from everyone they've ever loved, parents who are watching their children die because they've been told that accepting a blood transfusion would cost them their eternal life. Comment below with your city, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and stay with me as I reveal what really happens behind the closed doors of the Kingdom Hall, because what I'm about to tell you is not speculation or bitter apostate lies, it's the documented truth from someone who lived it from the inside for most of his adult life. The night that changed everything started ordinarily enough, with me arriving at the Kingdom Hall 30 minutes early as I always did, because elders were expected to set the example in punctuality and preparation. The parking lot was nearly empty except for Brother Morrison's ancient Buick and Sister Chen's minivan, and I remember noticing how the spring rain had left puddles that reflected the Kingdom Hall's exterior lights like scattered mirrors across the asphalt. I had my talk outline prepared for the Theocratic Ministry School, a 10-minute discourse on maintaining spiritual vigilance in a morally corrupt world, and I felt that familiar sense of purpose that came from serving in a position of responsibility within God's organization. My briefcase contained my Bible with its carefully highlighted passages, my reference books including the New World Translation Reference Edition and the Insight on the Scriptures volumes, and a notebook where I kept detailed records of everything discussed in elders' meetings, a habit I'd developed over the years that would later prove invaluable when I needed evidence for what I had witnessed. Brother Thompson, the presiding overseer, was already in his small office adjacent to the main auditorium, and I could see through the partially open door that he was on the telephone, his voice lowered to an urgent whisper that immediately struck me as unusual because Thompson was normally a jovial man who spoke in booming tones that could be heard across the parking lot. I walked past slowly, not intentionally eavesdropping but unable to ignore the snippets of conversation that drifted through the gap in the door, phrases like "we need to keep this absolutely quiet" and "the branch office says to handle it internally" and "if this gets out, the whole congregation could be stumbled." My stomach tightened with an unfamiliar feeling that I would later recognize as the first stirring of doubt, that tiny seed of questioning that the organization had trained us to suppress immediately as the influence of Satan trying to separate us from Jehovah's fold. I continued to the literature counter where I was supposed to organize the new magazines that had arrived from Brooklyn headquarters, the latest issues of the Watchtower and Awake. With their glossy covers featuring perfectly happy families in perfectly clean clothes standing in perfectly manicured gardens, the kind of artificial paradise that bore no resemblance to the actual lives of most witnesses I knew who struggled with depression, financial hardship, and the constant pressure to do more, give more, sacrifice more for an organization that promised everything but delivered only obligation and guilt. As I sorted through the publications, Brother Miller, the congregation secretary, rushed past me toward Thompson's office carrying a manila folder that he clutched against his chest like it contained state secrets, his face pale and drawn in a way that suggested he hadn't slept properly in days. These 2 men, pillars of our congregation, respected elders who gave talks at circuit assemblies and were held up as examples of spiritual maturity, looked like they were carrying a burden that was crushing them from the inside out. The meeting that night proceeded normally on the surface, with the usual attendance of about 70 publishers, families sitting together in their designated sections, children squirming in their seats while their mothers whispered stern reminders about proper Kingdom Hall behavior, teenagers slouched in the back rows with their Bibles unopened and their minds clearly elsewhere, probably thinking about the normal lives their school friends were living while they were trapped in this. fluorescent box listening to another talk about the dangers of higher education and the importance of putting kingdom interests first. I gave my talk without incident, discussing the need to avoid worldly entertainment that glorified violence and immorality, quoting scriptures I'd memorized decades ago, receiving the usual polite applause when I concluded and returned to my seat beside Sarah, who smiled at me with that practiced expression of wifely support that I now realize masked her own growing doubts that she would never dare express because questioning the organization was equivalent to questioning God himself. But after the meeting ended and the congregation dispersed into the parking lot with their usual small talk about field service arrangements and upcoming circuit assembly parts, I noticed that Brother Thompson pulled aside 3 other elders, including Brother Miller and Brother Davis, the service overseer, and they disappeared into the back room where judicial committees were held, that windowless space with its cheap paneling and uncomfortable chairs where witnesses were interrogated about their sins and judged by men who claimed to be guided by Holy Spirit but who often seemed more interested in maintaining organizational control than in showing Christ-like mercy. I lingered in the main auditorium, straightening chairs and picking up forgotten Bibles and children's coloring books, anything to give me an excuse to remain in the building, because something about the way those elders had moved with such urgency, the way their faces had betrayed anxiety and fear rather than the calm confidence we were supposed to display as shepherds of God's flock, it all triggered an instinct that told me something significant was happening behind that closed door. 20 minutes passed, then 30, and I was running out of reasons to stay when Brother Thompson emerged alone from the back room, his tie loosened and his forehead glistening with sweat despite the cool evening temperature. He spotted me immediately and his expression shifted from troubled to guarded in an instant, that defensive look I'd seen countless times when elders were hiding something they didn't want the regular publishers to know about, the kind of secrets that were kept for the protection of the flock but really existed to protect the organization's reputation. He approached me with forced casualness and suggested I should head home because there were some confidential matters the elders needed to discuss privately, and normally I would have accepted this dismissal without question because we were trained to trust the elder body implicitly, to believe that men appointed by Holy Spirit were always acting in our best interests even when we didn't understand their decisions. But something made me push back that night, perhaps the Holy Spirit of actual truth rather than the counterfeit version the Watchtower had sold us for decades. I asked Thompson directly if everything was all right in the congregation, if there was anything I could help with as a fellow elder, and I watched his face carefully as he calculated his response, saw him weighing whether to include me in whatever crisis was unfolding or to keep me at arm's length with platitudes and reassurances. He chose the latter, placing his hand on my shoulder in that patronizing gesture that older elders used with younger ones, assuring me that everything was under control and being handled according to scriptural guidelines and direction from the branch office, that I shouldn't worry myself about matters that didn't concern my specific responsibilities, that the most loving thing I could do was maintain my discretion and continue setting a good example for the congregation. I left the Kingdom Hall that night with an uncomfortable knot in my stomach, a feeling that something fundamentally wrong was being covered up, that the organization I'd devoted my entire adult life to was built on a foundation that couldn't withstand honest scrutiny. Sarah was already asleep when I got home to our modest 2-bedroom house in the suburbs, the house we'd bought with a small inheritance from my father's estate, furnished simply because the organization discouraged material accumulation in excess, decorated with framed pictures of paradise and calligraphy scripture verses because religious art was the only acceptable decoration in a spiritually minded household. I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying Thompson's nervous behavior and evasive words, wondering what could possibly be so serious that it required such secrecy, such obvious anxiety from men who were supposed to be confident in Jehovah's guidance and protection. The answer would come sooner than I expected, in a way that would force me to choose between comfortable ignorance and devastating truth, between maintaining my position in the organization and following the conscience that God had given me long before the Watchtower Society claimed ownership of my life and loyalty. That choice, when it came, would cost me everything I had built over 43 years, every relationship I valued, every identity I'd constructed around being a faithful Jehovah's Witness, a devoted elder, a spiritual man who had earned the respect and trust of hundreds of people who looked to me for guidance. But the alternative, staying silent about what I was about to discover, would have cost me something far more valuable than family approval or organizational status. It would have cost me my integrity, my humanity, my ability to look at myself in the mirror without feeling complicit in something profoundly evil masquerading as divine truth. 3 days after that strange Thursday meeting, I received an unexpected phone call from Brother Miller, the congregation secretary, asking if I could meet him at a diner 15 miles outside our territory, far from any place where we might encounter other witnesses who would wonder why 2 elders were meeting privately outside the Kingdom Hall. His voice on the phone carried a tremor of desperation that I'd never heard from him before, a crack in the facade of spiritual certainty that we were all trained to maintain regardless of our internal struggles. Miller was 55 years old, an accountant by profession, a man who had served as an elder for 28 years, who had conducted countless judicial committees and disfellowshipped dozens of people for violations of Watchtower rules, who had always struck me as the epitome of organizational loyalty, someone who would defend the society's positions even when they seemed unreasonable or cruel. The fact that he was reaching out to me privately, away from the oversight of the elder body, suggested he was wrestling with something that threatened to overwhelm his carefully constructed faith. I met him at the diner on Saturday afternoon, a dreary establishment with cracked vinyl booths and a perpetually flickering neon sign that advertised breakfast served all day. Miller was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he hadn't touched, his eyes scanning the entrance like he expected someone to burst through and catch us in some forbidden act. I slid into the booth across from him and waited, knowing from years of shepherding calls that sometimes people needed silence before they could find the words to express what was breaking them apart inside. We sat like that for nearly 5 minutes, the only sound the clatter of dishes from the kitchen and the country music playing softly from speakers mounted near the ceiling, before Miller finally looked up at me with eyes that had seen something they could never unsee, the kind of knowledge that changes a person fundamentally and irreversibly. What Miller told me over the next 2 hours would become the foundation of everything I would later discover about the organization's systemic cover-up of child sexual abuse, its protection of predators over victims, its prioritization of reputation management over child safety and justice. He started by explaining that the confidential matter Thompson had been handling involved a 13-year-old girl named Jessica, the daughter of Brother and Sister Reynolds, who had come forward with allegations that Brother Patterson, a respected ministerial servant who conducted Bible studies and was being groomed for elder appointment, had been sexually abusing her for the past 18 months during times when he was supposedly helping her family with home repairs and yard work. Jessica had finally gathered the courage to tell her parents after a talk at the Kingdom Hall about Jehovah-hating wickedness, believing that the elders would protect her and ensure her abuser faced justice, trusting the organization that had taught her since birth that it was the only safe place in a dangerous, Satan-controlled world. But instead of immediately reporting the abuse to law enforcement as any decent human being would do, as any organization that truly cared about child welfare would require, the elders had followed the Watchtower Society's internal policies that prioritized protecting the organization's reputation above all else. They had called the branch office legal department, speaking with attorneys who were more concerned about potential lawsuits and negative publicity than about a traumatized child who needed help and justice. The attorneys had instructed the elders to follow the two-witness rule, a policy based on a distorted interpretation of biblical passages about establishing testimony, which essentially required that unless there was a second witness to the abuse or unless Patterson confessed, the allegation couldn't be considered established and no action could be taken against him. This policy, Miller explained with barely controlled rage, was insane in cases of child sexual abuse, because predators don't typically molest children in front of witnesses, and victims are often too traumatized and manipulated to speak up immediately or coherently. The elders had interrogated Jessica in the back room of the Kingdom Hall, asking her explicit questions about the abuse while her parents sat outside unaware of what was happening, treating her not as a victim who needed compassion and protection but as a potential liar who might be trying to slander a faithful brother. They had called Patterson in for questioning, and he had vehemently denied everything, claiming that Jessica was emotionally unstable and possibly influenced by watching inappropriate television shows or talking to worldly friends at school, subtly suggesting that she was fabricating the allegations for attention or out of some twisted adolescent fantasy. Without a second witness and without a confession, the elders determined that the allegations couldn't be proven according to Watchtower policy, which meant Patterson would face no consequences within the congregation, would continue to have access to children during field service and at Kingdom Hall gatherings, would maintain his status as a ministerial servant working toward elder appointment. Even more disturbing, Miller revealed that the elders had counseled Jessica's parents not to report the matter to police, explaining that doing so would bring reproach on Jehovah's organization and could result in negative publicity that would stumble people and hinder the preaching work. They had quoted scriptures about not taking your brother to court before unbelievers, about handling matters internally within the congregation, about waiting on Jehovah to bring justice in his own time and way. Jessica's parents, faithful witnesses who trusted the elders implicitly, had reluctantly agreed to remain silent, believing they were doing the spiritually mature thing by prioritizing organizational interests over their daughter's need for justice and closure. Jessica herself had been warned not to speak about the allegations to anyone in the congregation or outside it, told that if she spread unproven accusations she could be guilty of slander and subject to judicial action herself, effectively silencing a child victim to protect her adult abuser in the organization's carefully crafted public image. Miller told me he had initially gone along with this handling of the situation, trusting that the branch office knew best, that their legal department understood the complexities involved, that following organizational policy was equivalent to following Jehovah's direction. But his conscience had been eating at him ever since, especially after he'd done some research and discovered that the Watchtower Society had been facing similar allegations in congregations around the world, that there were ongoing lawsuits involving victims who had been abused as children and then silenced by elders following the same policies that were being applied in Jessica's case. He had found news articles about judgments against the organization for negligence and cover-up, about internal databases containing names of thousands of accused child abusers who had never been reported to authorities, about systemic problems that suggested this wasn't just an isolated incident but rather a pattern of institutional failure that had destroyed countless lives while protecting the organization's reputation and financial interests. Miller pulled out a folder from his briefcase containing printouts of court documents, news articles, and leaked internal Watchtower correspondence that detailed policies for handling child abuse allegations, instructions to elders about maintaining confidentiality, warnings about the dangers of reporting abuse to secular authorities without first consulting the branch office legal department. As I read through these documents in that dingy diner booth, my hands literally shaking as I turned page after page of evidence that the organization I'd devoted my life to was systematically protecting child predators, I felt something fundamental break inside me, that core belief that Jehovah's organization was different from the corrupt religions of Christendom, that we were truly God's people guided by His Spirit and protected from the kind of evil that plagued worldly institutions. The documents made it clear that this wasn't ignorance or mistakes by individual elders, this was deliberate policy designed by the organization's leadership, approved by the governing body members who claimed to be the faithful and discreet slave appointed by Christ Himself to dispense spiritual food at the proper time. I asked Miller why he was showing me these documents, why he was risking his position as an elder and his standing in the congregation by sharing information that was clearly meant to remain secret. He looked at me with tears streaming down his face, the first time I'd ever seen him cry in nearly 15 years of serving together as elders, and he said that he couldn't live with the knowledge alone anymore, that he needed someone else to know the truth so he wouldn't feel crazy, so he could confirm that his conscience wasn't betraying him with apostate thinking but was actually responding appropriately to something genuinely evil being perpetrated in the name of God. He said he'd chosen me because he'd noticed my discomfort after that Thursday meeting, had seen the questions in my eyes, had recognized in me someone who might still have enough humanity left to be disturbed by what was happening rather than just falling in line with organizational directives that violated every principle of decency and justice. We sat in that diner until the dinner rush started and the waitress began giving us pointed looks about occupying a booth for 3 hours while ordering only coffee. Miller made me promise not to reveal our conversation to anyone, especially not to the other elders, because he wasn't ready to take a stand that would result in his immediate disfellowshipping for apostasy and the loss of his wife and adult children who were all deeply committed to the organization. I made that promise even though I already knew I wouldn't be able to keep it, because some truths are too important to remain hidden, some evils too destructive to be protected by silence, some betrayals of trust too profound to be covered over with appeals to loyalty and confidentiality. I left that diner a fundamentally different person than the one who had walked in 3 hours earlier, carrying knowledge that would destroy my life as I knew it but would also free me from complicity in an organization that had proven itself to be exactly what it accused other religions of being: corrupt, hypocritical, concerned with power and control rather than with truth and love. The weeks following my conversation with Brother Miller were the most agonizing of my entire life, a period of intense internal conflict as I wrestled with what I knew and what I was supposed to do with that knowledge. I continued attending meetings, giving talks from the platform, participating in field service, conducting Bible studies with people I was bringing into an organization I no longer trusted, all while carrying the weight of information that contradicted everything I was teaching them about the Watchtower Society being God's sole channel of truth on earth. The cognitive dissonance was crushing, waking up every morning and putting on the costume of a faithful elder while my mind screamed at the hypocrisy of defending policies that protected child abusers, of encouraging people to trust an organization that had betrayed the trust of countless victims in the most horrific ways imaginable. I started conducting my own investigation, using the primitive internet of the late 1980s to search for information about Jehovah's Witnesses and child abuse, spending hours at the public library researching court cases and news articles that weren't available in the sanitized publications we received from Brooklyn. What I discovered was far worse than Miller had revealed: a decades-long pattern of cover-ups and denials, of victims being disfellowshipped for speaking out while their abusers remained in good standing, of families being torn apart by shunning policies that punished those who sought justice through secular authorities rather than submitting to the organization's internal processes that consistently failed to protect children. I found testimony from former elders who had resigned in disgust after being ordered by the branch office to remain silent about known predators, from parents who had lost their children to suicide after the organization silenced and shamed them for reporting abuse, from lawyers who described the Watchtower Society's legal strategies as among the most aggressive and morally bankrupt they'd encountered in decades of practice. The more I researched, the more I realized that the child abuse cover-up was just one manifestation of a larger pattern of authoritarian control and manipulation that characterized the organization at every level. I started examining other doctrines and policies with fresh eyes, seeing for the first time how the Watchtower used fear and guilt to maintain control over members, how they isolated people from outside influences and critical thinking, how they demanded absolute obedience to human leaders while claiming that loyalty to the organization was equivalent to loyalty to God Himself. I looked at the blood transfusion doctrine that had killed thousands of witnesses who refused life-saving medical treatment based on interpretations of ancient dietary laws, at the shunning policy that destroyed families and drove people to depression and suicide, at the discouragement of higher education that kept members poor and dependent on the organization for their sense of purpose and community, at the failed prophecies about Armageddon's arrival that had been quietly revised and reinterpreted whenever the predicted dates passed without incident. I began examining the Watchtower Society's financial operations, discovering that despite claiming to be a humble non-profit organization supported by voluntary donations, they owned billions of dollars in real estate, operated profitable printing operations, and had amassed enormous wealth while encouraging rank-and-file members to live in poverty and sacrifice their financial futures to spend more time in unpaid preaching work that primarily served to recruit new members and distribute literature that generated more income for the organization. I found evidence of insider financial dealings, of governing body members and high-ranking officials living comfortably while ordinary witnesses struggled to pay rent and feed their families, of the organization investing donated funds in stocks and businesses that contradicted their own moral teachings about avoiding worldly entanglements and refusing to support war and immorality. The hypocrisy was staggering, the disconnect between what was taught from the platform and what was practiced by those in positions of power and authority. I also started paying closer attention to what was happening in my own congregation, seeing with new clarity the manipulation and control that I had previously accepted as normal spiritual guidance. I watched as young people were pressured into baptism before they were emotionally mature enough to understand the lifetime commitment they were making, then disfellowshipped as teenagers for normal adolescent behavior and cut off from their families as punishment for breaking rules they hadn't truly chosen for themselves. I saw marriages destroyed by the organization's extreme positions on headship and submission, women trapped in abusive relationships because divorce was only permitted in cases of adultery and leaving an abusive spouse could result in loss of privileges and social ostracism. I observed the toll that the constant pressure to do more took on people's mental and physical health, families living in cars because they'd sold their homes and quit their jobs in anticipation of Armageddon arriving in 1975, elderly witnesses who had never saved for retirement because the organization had promised them they would never grow old in this system, individuals suffering from untreated depression and anxiety because seeking mental health treatment was subtly discouraged as showing lack of faith in Jehovah's ability to provide peace and comfort. The breaking point came when I learned that Brother Patterson, the ministerial servant accused of abusing Jessica Reynolds, had been quietly moved to a congregation in another state, given a letter of recommendation from our elder body that made no mention of the allegations against him, effectively allowing him access to a new pool of potential victims who had no idea about his history. I discovered this when Sister Reynolds called me in tears, explaining that her family was being pressured to move to a different congregation because Jessica's presence was causing division and her inability to be around Patterson without visible distress was stumbling others who didn't know about the abuse. The elders had essentially decided that it was easier to relocate the victim and her family than to deal with the accused perpetrator, that protecting Patterson's reputation and the congregation's peace was more important than ensuring Jessica's safety and healing. I confronted Brother Thompson about this decision, demanding to know how we could possibly justify moving an abuse victim while allowing her alleged abuser to continue serving in a position of responsibility. Thompson responded with the party line about not being able to take action without proof according to scriptural standards, about needing to trust that Jehovah would handle the matter in his own time, about the importance of not bringing reproach on the organization by creating public scandal. When I pressed him about the moral implications of our inaction, about our responsibility to protect children regardless of organizational policies, he warned me that I was beginning to sound like an apostate, that questioning the direction we received from the branch office was equivalent to questioning Jehovah himself, that I needed to humble myself and accept that the organization's wisdom exceeded my own limited understanding. That conversation ended any remaining illusions I had about the possibility of reform from within. I realized that the problems weren't isolated mistakes or the failures of individual elders, they were systemic issues built into the very structure and theology of the organization, protected by a culture that demanded absolute obedience and punished dissent with the harshest consequences imaginable. I understood that speaking up would cost me everything, that the organization would label me an apostate and instruct every witness I knew to cut off all contact with me, that my wife would likely divorce me rather than remain married to someone who had rejected the truth, that my children and grandchildren would be taught to view me as a servant of Satan who had been misled by pride and independent thinking. But I also knew that remaining silent would make me complicit in the ongoing harm, that every day I continued to serve as an elder while knowing what I knew, I was helping to maintain a system that destroyed lives and protected predators. I spent long nights in prayer, not to the Jehovah of the Watchtower who seemed to require blind obedience and the suppression of conscience, but to whatever higher power might exist who valued truth and justice and compassion over organizational loyalty and reputation management. I asked for courage to do what I knew was right even though it would destroy my life, for strength to prioritize human welfare over comfortable conformity, for wisdom to navigate the impossible situation I found myself in where every choice involved betrayal of someone or something I had once valued deeply. The decision, when it finally crystallized in my mind, brought a strange sense of peace mixed with terror. I would document everything I had learned, compile the evidence I had gathered, and take it to secular authorities who had the power to actually investigate and prosecute rather than just maintaining internal silence and moving predators to new hunting grounds. I would also write a detailed letter to every member of the congregation explaining why I could no longer serve as an elder or remain part of an organization that protected child abusers, even though I knew such a letter would result in my immediate disfellowshipping for causing division and speaking against the organization. I would accept the consequences of my actions, knowing that I was choosing integrity over community, truth over comfort, the welfare of vulnerable children over my own security and reputation. I began my exit from the organization methodically, knowing that I had only one chance to make my voice heard before I would be silenced through disfellowshipping and the resulting complete social isolation. I typed my letter over several nights in early April of 1987, sitting at my desk in the spare bedroom while Sarah slept, detailing everything I had discovered about the child abuse cover-up, about Brother Patterson's case specifically and the broader pattern of organizational policies that prioritized reputation over justice. I included documentation from court cases, quotes from internal Watchtower correspondence, testimony from victims whose stories I had found through my research, all presented as factually and dispassionately as possible because I knew that any hint of emotional apostate ranting would be used to dismiss my concerns without actually addressing the substance of what I was revealing. I made 200 copies of the letter at a print shop 30 miles from our home, paying cash and using a fake name because I knew the organization would try to stop distribution if they learned about it in advance. I addressed envelopes to every publisher in our congregation whose address I could obtain from congregation records I technically wasn't supposed to access but which were stored in the Kingdom Hall's filing cabinet that I had a key to as an elder. I also sent copies to local news organizations, to the police department, to Child Protective Services, to anyone who might have the authority and willingness to investigate the allegations I was bringing to light. I knew this action would be viewed as the ultimate betrayal by the organization and by most of the witnesses who received my letter, that they would be instructed not to read it or to immediately destroy it as apostate literature designed to undermine their faith, but I had to try to reach at least a few people who might still have enough conscience left to be disturbed by what I was revealing. The night before I planned to mail the letters, I told Sarah everything. We sat at our kitchen table until 3 in the morning while I explained what I had discovered, showed her the documentation I had compiled, told her about my conversation with Brother Miller and my decision to go public with information that would result in my disfellowshipping and our complete ostracism from the only community we had ever known. I watched her face cycle through disbelief, anger, denial, and finally a cold realization that I was destroying our life together for the sake of principles she didn't share, that I was choosing integrity over our marriage, truth over our family's stability and social standing. She didn't try to stop me, but she made it clear that she wouldn't be joining me in exile, that she would remain loyal to Jehovah's organization even if it meant ending our 33-year marriage, that she would accept the elders' direction to limit her association with me to only what was absolutely necessary to maintain our legal union while treating me as spiritually dead. I mailed the letters on a Tuesday morning, dropping them in a postal box downtown and then driving to the police station to file a formal report about Brother Patterson's alleged abuse of Jessica Reynolds and the organization's cover-up of the allegations. The detective I spoke with was sympathetic but explained that because the abuse had occurred over a year ago and the victim's family was unwilling to cooperate with an investigation, there was little the police could do without additional evidence or witnesses. He took my statement and promised to keep the file open in case other victims came forward, but I left the station knowing that justice would likely never be served in Patterson's case, that he would continue his life unpunished while Jessica carried the trauma of what he'd done to her and the additional betrayal of the organization that had silenced her rather than protected her. The response to my letter was swift and brutal. By Thursday evening, just 2 days after I'd mailed the envelopes, I received a phone call from Brother Thompson informing me that an emergency judicial committee had been scheduled for the following night to address my actions, which he described as malicious slander against faithful brothers and apostasy for speaking against Jehovah's organization. His voice was cold and formal, nothing like the friendly tone he'd used with me during our years of service together, and I understood that I had crossed a line from which there would be no return, that the organization had activated its defense mechanisms to neutralize the threat I posed to its carefully maintained image. He didn't ask me to explain my reasons or try to understand why I had taken such drastic action, because in the organization's binary worldview there was no legitimate reason to criticize its policies or leadership. Any dissent was automatically categorized as the influence of Satan and pride-driven rejection of Jehovah's authority. I attended that judicial committee meeting on Friday night, walking into the back room of the Kingdom Hall where I had sat on the other side of the table countless times, interrogating others about their sins and determining their spiritual fate based on their level of repentance and willingness to submit to organizational authority. Brother Thompson, Brother Davis, and Brother Wilson sat across from me with my letters spread on the table between us, their faces set in expressions of stern disapproval mixed with what I recognized as genuine confusion about how one of their own had gone so wrong. They began by asking if I had written and distributed the letter, and I confirmed that I had, explaining that my conscience had compelled me to speak up about policies that were enabling child abuse and destroying lives. They asked if I recognized that my actions constituted apostasy and slander, and I responded that truth couldn't be slander, that documenting the organization's actual policies and their real-world consequences wasn't apostasy but rather the fulfillment of my obligation to protect the vulnerable and oppose wickedness wherever it existed, even within an organization that claimed to represent God. The committee meeting lasted less than 30 minutes, far shorter than many I had conducted for individuals accused of far less serious infractions, because my fate had been decided before I ever walked into the room. They read me scriptures about respecting those taking the lead and not speaking against God's anointed representatives, about the dangers of independent thinking and the necessity of unity within the congregation, about how Satan had blinded my mind and led me away from the truth through intellectual pride and refusal to submit to theocratic order. They announced that I was being disfellowshipped for apostasy effective immediately, that I was to have no contact with any Jehovah's Witnesses including my own family beyond what was legally required, that my name would be announced from the platform at the next service meeting as someone who was no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses, which was the organization's way of signaling to the entire congregation that I was to be completely shunned as spiritually dangerous and worthy only of their pity for having allowed Satan to mislead me away from paradise and into eternal destruction. I walked out of that Kingdom Hall for the last time on a cool April evening, my footsteps echoing in the empty parking lot, and I felt simultaneously crushed by grief and liberated by freedom. I had lost everything that had defined my identity for 43 years, my position as an elder, my standing in the community, my relationships with my children and grandchildren, my marriage in any meaningful sense, even though Sarah and I would continue living in the same house for another 2 years before she finally filed for divorce. But I had also escaped from a system of control that had dominated every aspect of my life, that had told me what to think and believe, how to spend my time and money, who I could associate with and what information I could consume, what was acceptable to question and what must be accepted without examination because the governing body had declared it to be truth. The weeks and months that followed my disfellowshipping were the loneliest of my life, suddenly invisible to people I had known for decades who would cross the street to avoid walking past me, receiving the news that my daughter had given birth to my 4th grandchild but I would not be allowed to meet her or attend any family gatherings where witnesses would be present, watching my son get married without me in attendance because including a disfellowshipped person at the wedding would have meant social consequences for him and his bride. I watched from outside the Kingdom Hall one Sunday morning as families filed in for the meeting, remembering when I had been part of that community, when I had felt the security of belonging to something larger than myself, when I had believed that these people were my eternal family who would stand beside me through persecution and hardship. Now they looked through me as if I didn't exist, as if our decades of friendship and shared experiences had been erased the moment the organization declared me unworthy of their association. But I also started experiencing aspects of life I had been denied during my years as a witness, the freedom to pursue education without guilt about taking time away from theocratic activities, the ability to form friendships based on genuine connection rather than shared religious affiliation, the space to develop my own thoughts and beliefs without constantly filtering them through Watchtower doctrine to ensure they aligned with organizational teaching. I read books that had been forbidden as apostate or worldly, philosophy and science and religious scholarship that challenged my assumptions and expanded my understanding of the world in ways I had never imagined possible. I attended a community college and eventually completed the bachelor's degree I had abandoned at 19 when the organization had convinced me that higher education was a waste of time in the last days, that Armageddon would arrive long before I could complete my studies and use my degree in a new system that wouldn't need educated professionals. I also connected with other former witnesses who had left the organization for similar reasons, people who understood the unique trauma of losing your entire social network overnight, of being labeled as evil by those who once claimed to love you, of wrestling with the cognitive damage caused by years of authoritarian indoctrination and thought control. Through these connections I learned about the broader ex-witness community, the thousands of people around the world who had escaped the organization and were rebuilding their lives, supporting each other through the difficult process of deprogramming and healing from spiritual abuse. I found therapists who specialized in religious trauma, support groups where I could process my experiences without judgment, online forums where former elders compared notes about the disturbing things they had witnessed and participated in during their years of service. I also discovered that my letter had made more of an impact than I had initially believed possible. Several families in the congregation had read it before destroying it as instructed, and the seeds of doubt I had planted eventually grew into full questioning of the organization's authority and truthfulness. Brother Miller eventually left the organization 2 years after my disfellowshipping, unable to continue serving as an elder knowing what he knew about the child abuse policies. Sister Chen, whose daughter had been secretly struggling with suicidal thoughts after being disfellowshipped for dating a non-witness, reached out to me 5 years later to thank me for helping her see that the organization's shunning policy was cruel and unscriptural, that she had chosen her relationship with her daughter over her standing in the congregation. Even Jessica Reynolds, now an adult living across the country, contacted me through a former witness support website to tell me that my willingness to speak up about her case had validated her experience and helped her understand that the abuse and the cover-up weren't her fault, that she wasn't crazy or wicked for being angry about how she'd been treated. The investigation into the Watchtower Society's child abuse policies that I had attempted to trigger with my police report never materialized in the 1980s. The organization was too powerful and the internet didn't yet exist to spread information that contradicted their carefully controlled public narrative. But decades later, journalists and lawyers and activists would uncover the same patterns I had documented, revealing to the world what insiders had known for years about the systematic protection of predators and silencing of victims. Court cases would force the organization to release internal documents showing they had records of thousands of accused abusers in their database who had never been reported to authorities, that the two-witness rule had been applied consistently to dismiss allegations that should have been investigated properly, that children had been damaged and destroyed while the organization prioritized its reputation over their safety and well-being. Looking back now from the vantage point of 70 years old, 37 years after leaving the organization, I don't regret the choice I made even though it cost me relationships I still grieve losing. My children remained in the organization and have raised their own children as witnesses, continuing the cycle of indoctrination and control that I had hoped would end with my generation. I've only met 3 of my grandchildren, brief encounters at family funerals where the shunning rules were temporarily relaxed out of respect for the deceased but where conversation was limited to polite formalities and any discussion of religion or my reasons for leaving was strictly forbidden. My daughter told me once, during one of those uncomfortable funeral receptions, that she still loved me but couldn't have a relationship with me because association with an apostate would jeopardize her own standing in the congregation and her children's spiritual welfare, that she had to choose between me and Jehovah. And of course there was only one acceptable choice in that false dichotomy the organization had created. I'm sharing this story now, 3 decades after the events I've described, because the Watchtower Society is still using the same policies that enabled the abuse I witnessed, still disfellowshipping people who speak up about injustice and immorality within the organization, still tearing families apart through shunning practices that violate basic human decency and the principles of love that Jesus actually taught before the organization twisted his message into a tool of control and manipulation. There are young people sitting in kingdom halls right now being groomed by predators whose histories have been hidden to protect the organization's reputation, families being destroyed by policies that prioritize institutional loyalty over human welfare. Individuals contemplating suicide because they've been cut off from everyone they love for the crime of thinking independently or questioning doctrines that don't withstand honest scrutiny. If you're currently a Jehovah's Witness watching this testimony, I know you've been trained to dismiss everything I've said as the bitter lies of an apostate who was too proud to submit to Jehovah's authority, someone who allowed Satan to mislead him through independent thinking and worldly wisdom. You've been taught that reading or listening to material critical of the organization is dangerous to your spirituality, that exposure to apostate thinking could lead you down the same dark path I've traveled. But I want you to ask yourself honestly whether an organization that truly had the truth would need to forbid its members from examining evidence or listening to alternative perspectives, whether God would require you to remain ignorant of facts in order to maintain your faith, whether Jesus would approve of policies that protect child abusers and shun people whose conscience compels them to speak up about injustice and wickedness. The truth isn't afraid of investigation, it doesn't require censorship and information control to survive, it doesn't need to threaten people with complete social isolation if they dare to question or examine evidence that contradicts official narratives. The Watchtower Society's insistence that members avoid any information critical of the organization, its practice of disfellowshipping and shunning anyone who expresses doubts or disagreements, its history of failed prophecies and policy changes that are presented as new light rather than admitted mistakes, All of these should raise questions in your mind about whether this organization is actually guided by God or whether it's simply another authoritarian religious group that uses fear and manipulation to maintain control over its members. I'm not asking you to automatically believe everything I've said. I'm asking you to give yourself permission to honestly investigate and think critically about an organization that claims your eternal life depends on absolute obedience to its authority. For those of you who have already left the organization or who are contemplating leaving, I want you to know that life after the Watchtower is possible, that you can build new relationships and find purpose and meaning outside the narrow confines of the Kingdom Hall, that the freedom to think for yourself and follow your conscience is worth the pain of losing relationships with people who value organizational loyalty more than genuine human connection. The transition won't be easy. You'll grieve for years over the loss of family and friends who will treat you as if you're dead. You'll struggle with guilt and fear that have been programmed into you through decades of indoctrination. You'll question whether you made the right choice every time you face hardship or loneliness in your new life outside the organization. But you'll also discover aspects of yourself that were suppressed during your time as a witness, develop authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than shared religious obligation, experience the profound relief of living according to your own values and conscience rather than constantly policing your thoughts and behaviors to ensure they align with organizational expectations. The journey is difficult but worthwhile, and there's a whole community of former witnesses ready to support you through the process of healing and rebuilding your life on a foundation of truth rather than the comfortable lies the organization sold us for so many years.